And at this point, I would like to say thank heavens for Pete Myers, my friend and colleague, who is now sitting next to me. Normally, he's opposite the hall in our new offices. Pete, welcome once again to the show. It's some time ago that you were here.
Very long time ago. I think the last time we talked, you were up in a balloon floating up in the air.
Oh, that's not even that long ago. That was. I remember exactly when that was recorded. It was the 16th of November of last year.
Oh, that's not so long ago.
And you know why I remember?
Why?
Because that day the same thing happened to me, which is happening to you tomorrow.
Which is? Oh gosh, yes. Well, I'm reaching the half century, yes, indeed.
Congratulations,
yes,
Pete, on reaching that magic 5-0.
Thank you.
And our listeners know that we stopped doing the BBLs, the so-called birthday bad luckers, because we stopped doing that after the 28th of February, but I'm making an exception for you, so congratulations. But when I said thank heavens for Pete Myers, I meant that very seriously, because you put me onto the fact that today, the 16th of April, marks the 100th birthday of Charlie Chaplin.
Yes, indeed. In fact, it's been marked all around the world, except in Holland, unfortunately. I'll come to that a little later. But this is Charlie Chaplin. I mean, when you say Charlie Chaplin, immediately you start to smile. And the marvelous thing about Chaplin, and that I consider him, there were three geniuses of cinema in my book, and there was Orson Welles, there was Alfred Hitchcock, and Charlie Chaplin. Today we use the word genius, so commonly we apply it to every hack in the world. No, there were only three in my book, and Chaplin was one. He revolutionized the cinema in a sense. Certainly he brought and made the world laugh at a time when it never thought it could. But I've been in the remotest corners of the world, Africa. And it was the magic of the silent film and the magic of Chaplin to watch Africans, to watch Indians, to watch Nepalese who couldn't understand a word of English, didn't need it because they could just identify with a little tramp.
Well, anyway, he became a star in the days of silent movies,
That's
so
right.
He didn't need words.
Didn't need words, and in fact, he was one of the rare individuals. He, in fact, refused to put words till his later films, and when he did start to speak, unfortunately, he failed. In fact, his last film, The Countess from Hong Kong, which he made in 1967, was an absolute flop. It's because he couldn't use words. He was the artist. He was the prime artist of mime and expressing emotions, with every part of his body. And I think we pay tribute to him because he was unique. And today, 100 years, of course, it's a great anniversary.
Yeah. You said you'd get back to that later on. The entire world probably today is showing Chaplin films, and possibly people are playing some of his music because he also composed music, as we know. Do you have any idea why Holland should be so slow in doing things like this? I mean, you're not Dutch, and I am. But...
Well, I won't be cruel about it. I just think...
be cruel if you want to.
It's just rather sad, because television, in fact, is where people get, all their images these days. And every television station, practically, throughout Europe, and certainly in America and elsewhere, paying tribute to Chaplin, except the Dutch. In fact, the British, naturally, because he was British, are going to have an extreme retrospective of his films, etc. But the Germans are doing it, the Swiss, everyone else. And what are we doing? Absolutely nothing. When are we going to do it? Perhaps next year, perhaps when he's 101, our programmers will get round to remembering it, this day.
Well, according to Heine, the German philosopher and author, we'll probably do it in 50 years, because he said that if the world comes to an end, then he'd go to Holland because everything there happens 50 years later. It might be, of course, but I doubt it very much.
I think the people who make up our television programs just don't look 10 years, in advance, a year ahead, and say, this anniversary we should do something.
Or,
strangely enough, they are doing it for Hitler, but not doing it for Chaplin.
Oh, well, that's a totally
And he
different
comes up on the
subject.
20th for 100 years.
You did something on that.
I did something on him
yesterday.
Yes, day before yesterday. Fine, okay, but I would have thought Chaplin was far more important.
Well, nowadays, of course, that we get so many foreign television programs as well on cable, it could be that Dutch television makers thought, oh, well, everybody else is going to do it, why should we? But once again, that's just benefit.
That's not the argument to go with it, because, I mean, there are a lot of good film buffs in this country, and people, in fact, a lot of Dutch people who had met Chaplin, who worked with him, and it would be nice to get their memories and their appreciation of him.
Look, with both, we're both 50, you're almost 50, I am, but we're still too young to really have witnessed the age of silent movies.
Right.
Of course, almost everybody at one point or another saw one of Chaplin's silent movies. What do you think made him such a genius? Why were people so moved looking at him?
I think it was the common touch. I think it's a cliche answer to say, but it's simply because The Little Tramp was the little man, and the little man is the man of the world. In other words, every little person who had a hard time in life, who had poverty, who had to be brought up in poverty, could identify. Charlie was not born with a silver spoon. He was born in abject poverty, as we all know, and he made himself. So I think to identify with the tramp, with his ill-fitting clothes, the little stick, he's always in trouble. In fact, he's always failing, and then in the end succeeding. This is like life. It's like the little guy who always longs to win the beautiful girl, but doesn't know how to do it. But in the end, by his goodwill, he does. And you notice in all the Chaplin films, he longs for the girl. And, at first she turns him away, and then finally he walks into the sunset with her. But what leads up to that is the mystery, the wonder of the little guy conquering everything else, all the obstacles in life. And that's what Charlie did. And this, I think, people identify with. I certainly would.
Yes, the image of the little man finally became something which had very little to do, I think, with what you just described, because let's face it, wasn't it IBM that chose him for their logo, more or less, lately in the past 5 or 6 years, where they showed Charlie in advertisements for computers, etc. And you'd say, what does Charlie Chaplin have in common with computers?
Absolutely nothing, I should think, unless you were to look at Hedda's foresight in a film like Modern Times, where he predicted, the takeover of the machine, in other words. So he stands as a symbol for that as well. No, I think also he was, if you say, what has he got to do with computer? He was one of the richest men the cinema ever produced. I mean, he's right up there among the greats, because Charlie was very clever. He was a founder of United Artists, the film company. Also, he was a man who knew how to safeguard his interests, and he made millions. This is one thing. The little tramp that we identified as the poverty-stricken little tramp was, in fact, one of the richest men in the world.
Yes, that part of his life is something that the ordinary person in
didn't matter,
but didn't know about.
They knew, but they didn't mind. They said, you earned it, Charlie. So if you know, go ahead and make it, because he was making it on their behalf. This was a psychological thing. So if Charlie was honored and crowned and making millions, it didn't matter to his public.
I always have a feeling that in his case, the character sort of detached itself from the person. Nowadays, we've got stars, and we know about the scandals and the marriages and divorces, etc. In those days, and especially in Charlie's case, I have a feeling that the image of the little tramp detached itself completely from the person Chaplin. People knew very little about the person Chaplin, but identified only with the character.
Well, it's, we tend to forget. I mean, I read a lot of history. I mean, Chaplin was before my time. I caught up with him in the gossip columns, let's say, towards the latter part of his life. And then he was an old man. But if you read the film histories, you'll notice that he was constantly in the pages. He was a scandal monger. Charlie was a great womanizer, and not just a womanizer. How can I put this? He liked young girls. Fresh young meat was his desire. And he had a lot of paternity suits, etc. And then, of course, he settled down after he married Una. And that was the daughter of the great playwright Eugene O'Neill. And that was it, okay, and raised his family. But before that, Charlie was, his private life was public domain.
Yes, of course.
And the image was different, certainly different. An astute businessman, a chap who liked the girls, and, and certainly young girls.
But, of course, we have to realize that in those days, public domain wasn't as public as it is nowadays. There was no television. Scandal magazines didn't circulate the world as they do now. So it probably remained within a smaller circle than it would have nowadays.
To some extent, not in America, because that was the heyday of the gossip columnists. So they would do everything they could.
Maxwell, etc.
Elsa Maxwell, Luella Parsons, and people like that, you see. And they were the ones who would spend their whole lives digging up any dirt they could on Chaplin.
Well, it didn't spoil his image. It didn't do any harm to his art.
In America, it did. That was the strange thing. Not so much that image, but in fact his politics.
Yeah.
They thought he was too left-wing and thought he was communist and all that nonsense. And in a sense, they hounded him out of America. And the irony is that years later, like Ingrid Bergman, who they hounded out as well, you know, when she fell in love with Rossellini. The same thing went to Chaplin. You know, he was an avid, this is the McCarthy era, avid left-winger communist, red lover and all this nonsense. And he went to Switzerland and took his fortune out and lived happily. Years later, they asked him to come back to receive a special Oscar, and Hollywood begs his forgiveness. This is just before his death in 1977. And, all right, it was a great emotional moment. So that chapter, America likes to think it's forgotten, but in fact it was a blot on Hollywood, on what they did, how they hounded this great man out.
The beginning of the end of Hollywood, as it was.
Yes.
Pete, thank you very much for, first of all, putting me onto this subject, and secondly, letting us share your knowledge. I hope that...
Oh, it's not so much. It's just that I read a lot of this stuff.
And I know by this rendition of Smile, sung by Pia Zadora, of all people, accompanied by the London Philharmonic Orchestra.